All right, good morning, class. We're going to get started now learning about some intermediate Python. So there isn't really so much of a theme for today. It's just kind of a few odds and ends, just some extra tools that might be useful to you, kind of building on top of what we did yesterday. A lot of what we're covering today is going to deal with lists in particular. So as I mentioned before, lists are a very powerful tool that are available to you in Python. And so it's good to learn different ways that you can work with them. But actually, before we can dive right into lists, we have to talk a little bit about functions first. So just to review real quick, I'm going to create a regular function for you in Python. So it's a pretty simple function. We can call it like so, add one with 4, like that. And it tells us 5. Great. 4 plus 1 is 5. Kind of what we would expect. Now, something I want to point out here real quick is that there's a difference between Python functions and JavaScript functions just in the syntax, being that Python functions always have to be at least 2 lines of code. We've got 1 line of code for the signature, they call it, the method name and the input parameters. And then there's got to be at least 1 line of code for the body. Python doesn't let us put these on the same line of code. So that's a little bit different from how JavaScript works. For example, let me just show you this real quick in like 2 seconds. In JavaScript, I can just make a function on 1 line. This is an empty function, has no input arguments, and it has no body, but it is a perfectly valid function in JavaScript. So I can run this. And so the type of operator tells me that, yeah, this is a function. So I have created a function here in JavaScript. I've done it in 1 line. It's not even assigned to a variable. This example here is not very useful or interesting. My point is just to demonstrate the syntax, that sometimes you want to put a function in 1 line because you only need to refer to it once very briefly. So unfortunately, the regular functions in Python don't let us do that. So Python actually has a second type of function that you can define just in case you need to make a really quick 1-line function that doesn't even need a name necessarily. So those are called Lambda functions. So unfortunately, the syntax for these looks quite different from regular functions, but the way they work is really the same. It's just there's a simpler way that you define them. So let me show you a quick Lambda function. So to create it, we use the Lambda keyword instead of the def keyword. And then we name the input argument. So I'm just going to call it X in this case, because we're just adding numbers. And then a colon after the input argument, and then the body of the function. Now, in the body of the function, it is just assumed that this value is returned. So I don't have to actually write return.
So I see though that it looks like you're not passing anything in. You're going to get to that. I'm good. We're good.
Right. So I haven't called it yet. I've just defined my function. But when we call it, that's going to look pretty similar. So we're going to add 2 to 2. And, oh, sorry. You need to actually print the value in order to see it. Great. So 2 plus 2 gives us 4. I can invoke this Lambda function in exactly the same way as a regular function. It's just in the definition looks a little bit different. So I have this, abbreviated syntax, so I can define this function in one line without as much typing. So that's useful if you find yourself defining lots of small functions. Maybe you don't want to go through all the song and dance of the def keyword and the parentheses and like the multiple lines. It's a few extra characters you have to type. I guess the lambda keyword is longer than the def keyword, but whatever. It's a little bit more concise to use a lambda in one line than to use def normally. Now, the reason why I'm introducing lambda functions right now, because I told you this was going to be mostly about list methods, is because there are a handful of list methods, ways you can operate on a list, that in order to specify what exactly you want to do to that list, you have to pass it a function. And that function will get called on every element of the list. Now, you can just use a regular function, but it's very common that people will use lambda functions in these kinds of situations, just because they just need to define a function really quickly that's only going to get used once. So it doesn't even need a name, really. So, Jake, got a question?
Sorry about that. Yes. So can you just maybe talk through like the lambda, like add to is the name of the function equals, and then we need the lambda. Could you just like maybe talk it like through in
Yep.
English?
Yeah. So add to is the name of the function. Whatever's on the right side of this equal sign, that's just getting assigned to this label, this name, add to. Lambda is the keyword that creates this function initially. It's like analogous to def. That's just the word we type that tells Python, like, we're making a function here. And then the colon is what separates the function arguments from the function body. So X is just a name that we're choosing right here. I could have called this anything else, input argument, just as long as it's consistent.
Okay, so that to the left of the colon is like the parameter.
Yeah, so the left of the colon is like this thing over here, this X up top in the parentheses.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and then the right of the colon is everything indented underneath.
Okay, got it.
Mm-hmm. Evan?
Are there any like weaknesses of lambda functions? Like, are they super slow, or is anything else that we should know about that?
So from a technical mechanical perspective, as best I understand, they're exactly the same as regular functions in JavaScript. Really, the only difference is syntactical, stylistic. It affects the legibility of your code. So in some cases, you might think that using a regular function is just too verbose. You don't need to, spend 2 lines to do something that you could read in 1 line. So you'd prefer a lambda function. But for most cases, I think a lambda function is going to be way too dense. Very few functions, I think, can fit into 1 line of code. So for the most cases, we use regular functions. But yeah, it's really just about readability in my mind.
Thank you.
John?
Yeah, so can you have multiple parameters? And if so, do you have to put them in parentheses or anything like that?
You can. This isn't super common, though. Usually lambda functions only have 1 argument. But let me think, how do we do this? So you can comma separate them, I believe. You put argument and other arg. Yeah. So we can use a comma to separate the multiple input arguments on the left side of the colon.
Okay, thanks.
Evan, do you have another question?
No, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
This is the funny thing about remote classes, because if this was all in person, nobody would forget to put their hand down. That would get tiring pretty quickly. Okay, so people feel pretty good about just the basic syntax of lambdas. All right, so let's do something a little more interesting. I'm going to show you a list method filter. So filter is a method that you can call on a list, and it returns a new list that has most of the same items, but some of them will be missing. So important to note, filter returns a new list. It does not modify your original list, which is good. That's what we want. As much as possible, it's easier to reason by your code if you're not actually manipulating your data, and instead you create new data. So the filter method helps us do that because it's not going to change our list at all. It just gives us a new list that has the filter applied to it. So again, in filter, we'll use a Lambda function to specify which elements should be filtered out. So let's get a list here first. And now I'm going to filter. So I'm going to make, okay, so first of all, so I'm calling filter, I'm passing in my list. So that's, what I'm applying this filter to, but I also need to tell the filter function what I'm doing to my list. And so to specify what I'm doing, I pass in a function, a lambda. Because functions are just, a list of instructions to perform. So this function is going to take in each of the items of this list one at a time. So I'm just going to call it item, just a pretty generic name. Then for what we're going to do, this function, looking at this item, needs to return true or false to indicate if this item belongs in the output. So this is a pretty trivial example. I'm saying that I want multiples of 3 to be included in my new list, and then everything else should be removed. So in this logical expression here, we're taking the item from our list. So first that's going to be 1, then 2, 3, etc. We're running this logical expression, checking if that item mod 3 is 0. So if it's evenly divisible by 3, and then if so, we return true because Lambda functions automatically return just the result of this calculation. And then by running this function on every element of the list, we can determine which elements belong in the new list. So if I print out my list, what are we expecting to see here?
I would assume no change because you're creating a new list, right?
Right. So like what I just said, calling filter on the list does not modify the list. It returns a new list, but I'm not assigning that list anywhere. So it just kind of disappears. So let's actually see what that looks like. We've got our new list. Okay, so this is one of the fun little things about Python. A lot of these list methods don't actually return lists. They return a list-like object that you can easily convert into a list. Let's do that real quick. Okay, there. Now you can actually see the filtered result. JavaScript, I think, is a little bit more elegant in this regard, in that any list operation returns a new list. So it's really easy to just chain things one after another. So in this particular case, Python's going to look a little bit less elegant, but that's fine. So anyways, you can see here that I have removed certain specific items from the list. In other cases, there might be different arbitrary criteria that you need to filter a list by. Maybe you have a list of users and you're removing people who are inactive or users that don't have passwords set. Those don't belong in your list for whatever reason. Or if you have a list of days of the week and you want to remove all the Saturdays and Sundays, so you just have the weekdays. There could be a lot of different reasons. Alicia?
So you mentioned that you have to do the print list, new list for filter. Is that the same for map and reduce as well?
Probably.
Okay.
If I'm remembering correctly, I'm pretty sure that's what's going to happen. But yeah, I do most of my mapping and filtering in JavaScript, so that syntax is always like closer to the front of my mind. Nathan, did you have your hand up?
Yes, it did. So I know it doesn't exactly apply to this particular example, but is there an equivalent of a ternary key operator if you want to do more than just like a true or false?
There is. That is actually coming later on in this lecture, but it doesn't really fit in there. It doesn't really fit in anywhere else, so I might as well just show it now since you asked about it. This is going to be pretty brief. So we showed you in JavaScript, there's a ternary operator. We would say, let x equals So we have this ternary in JavaScript where we have a logical expression. And then if it's true, we use the value on the left side of the colon. If it's false, we use the value on the right side of the colon. So this is a very conventional syntax. There are a few other programming languages I've used that also have the ternary operator, and it uses this exact same syntax with the question mark and the colon. So even though it's kind of unintuitive, at least it's pretty common, pretty universal. Python takes sort of a different approach. They have a totally different syntax, which is much more intuitive. It's much easier to read, but just because it's different from other programming languages, I'm not really sure how I feel about it. So here's the same thing in Python, same kind of thing in Python. So this is a ternary in Python. Instead of using more punctuation marks, it uses if and else, which I think is a little bit weird, honestly, because this isn't really an if statement. It's actually like kind of phrased backwards from an if statement. Because like the condition is sort of in the middle here. And then like the result is at the start. I don't know. But anyway, this is a ternary statement in Python. So if number is greater than 10, then X has the value hello. Otherwise, it gets the value of goodbye. Great. Was there a hand up?
Yeah, that was me, but you answered the question. Thank you.
Cool. So yeah, that's ternaries in Python. That's all I got to say there. We can get back to our lambdas now.
Appreciate it. Pretty weird looking, but thanks for showing me that.
No problem. All right, so that was filter. Pretty useful list method. Moving on, I'm going to show you another one, map. This is maybe my favorite list method. No, second favorite list method. But definitely one that I use very commonly. So now I warned you before that map is a word that you're going to hear in multiple different contexts. So this is another similar but slightly different use of map. So the map function takes an array as input and a function that describes how to transform individual array elements. And then it returns a new array of the same length, which with each element transformed in that way. Is there a hand up?
Yeah, by array, do you mean list in Python?
Yes, yes, I do. I'll potentially get that mixed up sometimes just because those are the equivalent data structures in Python and JavaScript, and lots of other languages have arrays as well. So I guess that's another situation where Python tries to do things in a more intuitive way, but just because it's different from so many other programming languages, it can be a little bit awkward. But yeah, so let's see mapping. So my list, actually, we're going to use the same list, 10. Say bigger numbers is map. So I'm calling map. We have to pass in my list. Now we also need a Lambda function that describes what we're doing to each item in this list. So this is going to be a pretty simple one. Let's say I just want to create a new list where every number is 2 larger than in the previous list. So we've defined a Lambda function here that's going to look at each item individually, one at a time. And then for each item, we're going to calculate that item plus 2 and then return that value. Because again, Lambda functions automatically return whatever the result of their calculation is. So let's see what our bigger numbers look like. Pretty sure this is not going to actually be a list, but some list-like object that'll have to convert into a list. Yeah, it's a map object. When you call map, it gives you map object. So if I want to just read this real quick, turn that into a list. Cool. So now instead of going from 1 to 10, we're counting up from 3 to 12.
I have a question.
Mhm.
Why does it return object? Like, why does it return list objects or map objects? Why doesn't it just return the map or the list?
That's a good question. I don't know. It would seem more intuitive to me that you would want a list object so you can do more listy things to it. But there are special things you can do with maps that lists don't do.
Mine is actually giving me mine. I didn't have to put list ahead of it and it came out the same way.
Yeah. You just did map on the list with the function, and without converting it into a list, you were able to.
Yeah, and
just
it gave me
under-
that same output that yours did when you made it a list. It gave me the array.
Do you have any additional like plugins installed on your VS Code that might do that?
Not that I know of.
Yeah, I tried it too. I had to do list for it to print for mine.
Yeah, same.
Curious. I mean, it might just be something about how your version of Python is choosing to display the data. Like, I don't know, I'm on version 3.9. Maybe there's some differences in other versions of Python. I don't know if it's different if you're running it at the terminal like this versus, like, I don't know, there's this run button up here. There might be other ways you're running your file. I'm not sure. We could take a look at that offline maybe. But I would expect that you'd have to convert it into a list to do a lot of like standard list operations. So yeah, this looks pretty like normal Python to me.
Yeah, so just back on that question, then the reason for it returning the object is this, so you could do other methods on that object that maybe list wouldn't have. Was that it?
Right.
Okay. Thanks.
But I'm just not sure what those methods are and why I would want them. I would just think that the methods on the list are more what I want. Like if I started with the list, I want to end with the list. But that's just my opinion. All right, so mapping is super useful. This is something you're going to do a lot. I feel like early in my career, a lot of what I was doing was just filtering and mapping and also sorting lists. That's the next thing we're going to cover is sorting. So just generally, like as a junior developer, intermediate developer, being able to manipulate lists of data and get them into the shape you want them to be is practically what I spend a lot of my time doing. And I think that's what a lot of junior developers do. Oh, got a couple hands up.
Yeah, my question is, do you need the Lambda keyword after like map and filter? Like, would you be able to put the define keyword or def keyword?
No, you can't use def in line. Def can only be used like as its own block on its own line.
Okay.
So yeah, there's nothing else going on lines 1 and 2 except for me defining this function. You can't
Okay,
do it
but
in
when
line
you
of
use
others.
filter and map, and probably when we get to sort, we'll need the lambda in there, like after.
Lambdas are useful. I mean, you don't honestly need to use a lambda. So like I could have just defined a regular function and then pass that function in by name. And I'm actually going to do that with sort later on.
Okay.
But in general, like if I'm only going to use this function once, then like I don't even want to bother giving it a name.
Okay, I see.
Did we have another hand up?
Yeah, so my question was, whenever you called that bigger numbers, you had to convert it to a list. Would you just be able to convert bigger numbers to a list itself? So like before, when you have map, would you just be able to do a list before that and you would get what you want?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yep. Jake?
Sorry. No, I don't.
Dalton?
So in JavaScript with these, so I guess really, why don't these, like, why doesn't map and filter have default parameters? Like, why do you have to make, like, because in JavaScript, if you do like an array function, usually you just pass a parameter instead of putting a function in there. Is it just for more like having more options to have you put an actual function into it?
I'm not sure if I follow your question. Can you say that another way?
So like say like for instance, like I'll use a simple one, like in JavaScript, if you use like whatever array dot push, it's already got that parameter of like what you're putting in there, which probably is not a great example, but maybe you understand. But where it's like, you know, map, because that's a function, right? Map is a function on its own. So why doesn't that have like default parameters where you already put them in there instead of having to make a whole new function?
I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. What default parameters do you mean with push?
Like, so, cause kind of like, so if you use, like, I think push is bad because it's so simple, but I can't, like sort maybe, or like splice or slice. Like, so you put already the two in there and it does it automatically and it gives you a new one. Whereas like map, it kind of sounds like, I don't know, I guess it is a parameter, but it's just like a function parameter, I guess is probably a better way of asking that.
Yeah, I mean, functions are just values, like other values. There's a whole bunch of types they can have, numbers,
So-
strings, lists, function. So I just passed in two values to map. The first one's a function and the second one's a list.
Cool.
I think the thing that map does is it's handling a list of items, an array, and then it's applying a function to each item in that list. So it's actually, instead of taking a variable and doing the function on it, it's walking through each item in the list, putting that function against each item, and then giving you a new list with each item affected by the function. So map actually,
It's kind of like a loop almost.
yeah,
in my
it's
head.
like, that's what map's doing, is it's kind of looping that function through the array. So it's the intermediary that handles that.
Yeah, for sure. So mapping is really like a form of iteration. Anything that you could do with map, you could also do with just a regular for loop. But mapping is a more specific tool. It's a more meaningful tool. So if what you need to do in your code, like conceptually, is mapping, you should use the map function so that communicates to other readers of your code what it is that you're doing. Like if you very specifically, you have an array or you have a list and you need to create a new list that is the same length, but it differs in some systematic way, like, you know, all the numbers are bigger by 2, you should use map there because that's what you're doing. So if you just have a for loop, like you can put the same logic in a for loop, but people will have to read that a little bit more closely to understand what you're doing. Whereas if I just see a map call, before I've even read the Lambda function, I already know, like, okay, we're gonna apply some logic to every element of this array and create a new array of the same length. Like before I've even read the details of your logic, I have a pretty good high level idea of what we're trying to accomplish.
Cool, that makes sense.
Let me give you one more map example just to kind of inspire you here. Say names. So this is the kind of thing I've had to do a whole bunch. You get like, you know, a list of strings or something, and you have to build objects around them. So we'll say, so this Lambda takes in a person, or I guess takes in the baby name, And then it will return a dictionary to properties of name, baby name, and age being 0, because these people were just born. Look at people. All right, I have to actually pass in the list that I am mapping over. Cool, so now I've transformed my list of names into a list of objects, into a list of objects that include the baby name, but also have other details on there as well. Commonly, you'll have to do this in the reverse. Where, I guess. So here, this is doing the reverse and basically mapping over my list of people here, this list of dictionaries, to turn it back into just the list of names. So with this Lambda function, it's doing kind of the reverse work, and we're plucking out one property from each of these objects, and then returning a new list that is just that one property instead of the list of objects with that property. So these are pretty common uses for map in my experience.
Sorry, and I'm getting a little confused by the word after lambda. Can you tell me what that part is for again?
That is the input argument. So it's the equivalent to like an irregular function, just this X here in the parentheses.
Oh, okay.
So it's saying that this function here, this function is going to get called on every element of our baby names list. And for each one, when we call this function, we're going to use this variable baby name to refer to each of these elements in turn.
Would you mind taking that example one step further? And if you had another list of the same length of ages, could you then apply age of index 0 to Alice in an object? So basically merging the two lists into one, pulling the name from baby names and the age from, baby ages, and creating an object from that.
I'm not sure if I would use map for that.
Okay.
So you're saying you have two arrays to begin with and you want to kind of merge them?
Into an object, yeah, dictionary, I mean.
Yeah, I don't think I would use map for that. I'm not exactly sure how I would approach that. Maybe if you give me a couple of minutes, I could come up with a solution I like. But mapping is specifically for where you have one list and you want to transform each of those items into something else in a way that you can specify in one function. So I'm not sure. I guess you could have that function looking at another list. That might get a little weird. I'd have to think about this a little more. Sorry.
Well, you could just define another variable that's a list, right? And then just pass that variable into the Lambda function at the same time, correct?
So I don't get to pass variables and I don't get to pass values into the Lambda function. here. So like, if I was going to define this with another argument, it wouldn't matter. This thing never gets used because I never actually call this Lambda function myself. So I'm never passing any values into it. It's Python calls this function for me. And when it calls this function, it's going to just pass in one argument at a time, just the one element of this list, or each element of this list. So in fact, if I define it with 2 arguments, I'm pretty sure this is going to crash. So yeah, I
But then you
defined,
don't have to use lambda, right? For map.
correct. I could have just used a regular function. See a couple hands up.
So for the on the just names, just to be clear, the person parameter would be a dictionary, right? It'd be looking for a dictionary.
Correct. So that's how we're able to index into it and access this property.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to ask that if you can use map on other iterables, like I know in Python you can iterate through a string, for example.
I want to say that you can. Let's try it. So,
Or a dictionary, something different that is not a list.
what was it? Okay, string dot upper. Let's see what happens. That. So I can map over my name. It returns a map object. What if I turn that back into a string right at the end? Doesn't seem like it likes that. List. Okay, so that's something.
Oh, that's nice.
And then as a list, I could join it to turn it back into a string. Yeah, that's a fun little thing to keep in mind is that strings are very similar to lists in a lot of ways. This is true in both Python and in JavaScript. And in some cases, they have the exact same methods that you can call on either of them. But in other cases, you can convert a string into a list and then kind of treat it like a list and then convert it back.
Thanks.
Caleb?
Yeah, so just to clarify, when you use map, that limits your Lambda function to 1 variable, correct?
Right. Just the way map works is expecting you to give it a function that accepts 1 variable, 1 input argument.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, that's just how map works. What other questions do we have? No questions? Okay. So I'm going to show
I
you.
have a question. Sorry. For the list, is there a reason you can think of that would cause it to come out reverse? So like when I print, when I printed the same thing as you for the just names, or sorry, for people, it prints it out with the age first and then the name. And I have it written the same way that you have it.
So you're seeing you're doing print people here. And then, so I'm getting name Alice age 0, but you're getting age 0 name Alice.
Yeah, but I have it written the same way as you, where name is first, and I'm not sure why it's reversing it.
Mhm.
Is that something that you, just if it's something that you've seen before, otherwise I'll touch base with you later to try to figure it out.
I've not seen this before, and I have no idea why that would be. But again, I said this the other day that you should treat dictionaries as being unordered. So you just shouldn't even have strong expectations about what order the keys will appear in. You should write your programs such that they work correctly, even if the keys appear in a random order every time. Just because the order of properties in a dictionary or an object, or well, so definitely in JavaScript, objects are not in a defined order. I keep hearing about how in most recent versions of Python, dictionaries are ordered or they can be ordered. I feel like I should look this up. So I guess it depends on which version of Python. So it should be ordered based on the insertion order. So yeah, I'm not sure why it would be any different on your machine. Maybe we could take a look at it later. But again, there's a way that you can write your code so that it doesn't matter what order you get the keys in. Because usually you're just going to directly access the key that you want. You don't usually like loop through objects and process the properties one at a time. So short answer is I don't know, but it probably shouldn't matter. What other questions do we have? Skylar?
I guess kind of a comment there. I was able to just do a quick example where it does take in 2 list examples for the Lambda list here. And like I put a number and a letter, so just made 1, 2, 3 as a list and then ABC as a list. And then passed them both in the Lambda.
Neat. Do you want to share your screen for a quick second and show us what you're talking about?
Yeah, for sure.
I know this is supposed to be my lecture, but you can mix it up a little.
Oh, good. Yeah. You guys see it? Can I make this bigger for you guys?
Yeah, Command plus or Control plus should increase the font size.
Hey, there you go. Oh, look at that. I can see.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you just told me that.
That's so nice.
Okay, so you're taking in 2 lists as the input.
Right.
And then your Lambda function also takes 2 arguments. And then so in the body of it, you're using both of them. Okay. That's interesting. I didn't know Python supported this.
Yeah, I think you were saying you don't want to do this, right? If you're doing something like this, then you probably should be doing something else. Or
geez, I don't know how I feel about this. Like,
this almost seems like it. I don't think we're going to do something like this, right?
Probably not commonly. So I guess here's my issue. I would say that conceptually what you're doing here is not mapping. Like, to me, mapping means you have one set of things that you transform into some related set of things. Like, think about a literal map. It's a very small, like rectangular piece of paper that is supposed to represent the globe. And there's a systematic relationship between your map and the globe, being that the map is much smaller and flatter, but it's supposed to represent the same set of places. So if you're merging 2 lists into one list, just like conceptually, I wouldn't call this mapping. But like if what you actually need to do is merge 2 lists into one list, this seems like a fairly elegant way to do it.
I'm wondering with this map, we said before that the map is working off of the length of the argument that you give it, right? So it's going to give you a returned list of same length. So in this case, you have two arguments that happen to be the same length, but which one is dictating the?
I'm expecting what, I don't know how or why that would work. This looks very bizarre to me.
Yeah,
Maybe
so-
you just pass in none for the last, or wait, what is going on here?
I just did an extra for it, just printed without the 4.
So in this case, so is it prioritizing the shorter list, or is it
Oh, I
going to
guess it would
prioritize the
be-
second argument?
Well, I guess that would be, it wouldn't, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think it's too much room for error because your lists have to be exactly the same size.
Could
Or-
you try making list 1, 1, 2, 3, and then list 2, A, B, C, D, just to see what that does?
Yeah, so it doesn't like it when they don't match up, and it ignores values.
I'm surprised it ignores it instead of just throwing an error though. That's
Yeah.
really strange.
Or just throwing it in by itself in an object.
So yeah, I didn't know you could do that. In like other programming languages, map is a method that you call off of the list itself. So there's no possible way to like call map with two lists. But since here, the list is an argument that gets passed into the map function with slightly different syntax, I guess it's possible to just pass in multiple lists, and Python handles that. Usually you're only mapping one list at a time. This is kind of surprising me. Not what I was expecting to see.
Yeah, that's why I was like, I got to say something.
Thanks for sharing that. Today I learned. All right, so one last function I want to show you before we take a break. I'm just going to show you reduce very briefly. Then when we come back, I'm going to show you sort, which is my all-time favorite list method. So want to make sure, you know, we're ready to hear that. So you get a break, be refreshed and everything. So reduce takes a list and then reduces it down to a single value. It's an extremely generic method, can do almost anything, but basically what it does is it lets you look at each item in turn and then calculate a new item to look at the next time, so that you're kind of like accumulating things from one call to the next, and then ultimately returns a single item. So a little bit awkward to describe. The most simple example is just summing numbers in a list. So again, we're going to use the my list. It's just the numbers 1 through 10. So actually first, there is another, so let's see, there's a module we need to import. Reduce is actually not like globally defined by default, but it is built in. We just have to import it. Or tools has just some extra functions that you don't need every day, but you might need sometimes. So Python provides them to you if you ask for them. So I'm going to import func tools at the top of my file. So that allows me to access this throughout this file. So now this Lambda function is going to take two arguments. The first one is called an aggregator. And then the second one is more familiar. This is the item. I'll explain this in just a second. So just like before, you know, as with map and filter, when we call reduce, passing in a list, this function is going to get called on every item in the list. And when we do call it on those items, that item gets passed in as item, this parameter here to our Lambda function. But then also, whatever we return from our Lambda function, that gets passed into the next call as the aggregator. So let me just like walk you through this verbally. We've got our my list is just the numbers 1 through 10. So the first time that this reduce Lambda function gets called, actually, I'm not sure what the aggregator is the first time. I think it's just the first number.
Yeah, I think it's the first item in the list.
If it works like JavaScript, it defaults to the first number if you don't specify. How do you specify in Python what you wanted to start with?
I'm not sure actually. There must be a way. I don't usually think about that too much. Not a common problem I have to deal with. But so anyway.
Slice it?
Pardon?
You will use slice? If you want to start from not the 0. Not sure, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Sorry, I just got a little distracted, but I'm not sure if that would meet our needs. Let's continue. Sorry. I just want to explain this real quick before I forget here. So yeah, so the first time the aggregator should be 1, first element of the array, and then the item would be 2, the next element of the array. So we're going to return the aggregator plus the item, so that's going to give us 3. So then the next time when we call this Lambda function, the aggregator is 3, and then the item will be 2, the next item in the list. So we add them together, that's 5. And then this gets called on the next item in the array, in the list, sorry, where the aggregator is 5, just whatever we returned from the last iteration. And then the item is the next item in the list. And so by doing that item by item, we can add all of them together. I guess
Could
that's,
you remind me what aggregator means again?
so aggregating is like just adding everything together, basically, just keeping track of all the things so far. So like in theory, like the aggregator should include the results of all the previous calls. So in this case, we're adding the item to the aggregator every time. So the aggregator gets bigger and bigger because we're just adding numbers onto it. In other situations, like the aggregator could be a list, and then you would push the item onto the aggregator every time. So it becomes a longer and longer list. So one way or another, the aggregator should like include the results of all your previous calls based on those previous items. But it's like really generic how exactly you do that, what exactly you do. So I just want to show you this simple example with sums. But commonly, like I don't actually use reduce in my daily life, in my day job. I've really only talked about reduce for teaching it because it is like kind of a fundamental function. Like people will possibly ask you about it, like, oh, do you know reduce? And like ask you to explain what it does. It might come up in an interview or whatever. It's just thought of as like one of those classic functional programming functions. But like practically speaking, I don't use this ever. It's very low level. I would more commonly just use a map or filter or just a regular for loop. Got some hands up?
I just put that the sum, the little function we used did into Python tutor, and it gave a pretty good visual of what's going on. You guys want to see it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to share your screen real quick?
I was kind of confused until I put it in here, and like it made it easy to visualize. So it's going down the code. And then here's where it goes to the aggregator and the item. So it's the first one. And the next step, it adds 1 + 2, 3. 3 is now the aggregator. And 3 + 3, 6. 6 is now the aggregator, and then so on and so forth, all the way down that list to the last item. If that makes it easy to understand.
Yeah, that's definitely what I was trying to explain to people. Thanks for showing us that.
Hey, can you share that that link?
I'll post it in the chat. It works for Python and JavaScript. It's like a visual of what you're doing. Give me a sec.
Great, thank you.
Can you put it in Slack if you don't mind?
All right, got a few more hands up. Let's hear some questions.
So I noticed that the func tools, you probably mentioned this earlier, sorry if I spaced out. The func tools for mine says I need Pylance as an extension to my VS Code, is that correct? This is not defined. And then it kind of says func tools is not defined, and then it says Pylance, report an undefined variable.
So I'm not sure if you need Pylance specifically, or, oh, I guess I have it. So maybe you do need it.
Okay. So does that mean functools.reduce? Is reduce not available outside of that extension, or?
So Pylance is not providing functools to you. Pylance is just providing like the autocomplete and like the in-editor documentation and stuff like that. So that's just what lets your editor know that it exists, but you don't need Pylance to use it. It's built into Python. It's available to you.
Mine's grayed out.
I mean, if you tried running the code.
It says functools is not defined.
Did you pull it in at the top of your function?
Oh, yep, that's what I missed. Thanks, appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry if I forgot to
I missed
mention
that part. No, you're good. Thanks.
Do we have some more questions?
Yeah, I guess I just had a quick question about, I think I'm grasping it, but for the Lambda, what variable is like being set, I guess, right, with ag plus item? Normally, I'm just used to seeing like ag equals ag plus item, for instance. So I was just like, is it changing the item variable or both or just one? And then to the right of the colon there. Like which variable is being set, like ag plus item? Is ag being set or is it item? Or I guess it doesn't matter, right?
Ag is the one that's being pushed forward.
Yeah, and because it's there, it goes to the first parameter when it goes back in it, right?
Yeah.
If I make
it's A plus B, and then that sum becomes A, and then it adds a new B. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm grabbing now. Thank you.
You got it. All right. So that's what I've got to say about reduce. It's a pretty low level method. Like you could create map and filter using reduce, but we already have map and filter, so we just use those. Again, I don't really use reduce. It's just something you should be aware of. Caleb?
Yeah, just to clarify, ag and item, we just have those listed. Those are just two variables, correct?
Yep.
Okay.
Could have called them anything else as long as I was consistent in the definition and in the body. All right. So do we want to take a quick break here? People need to use the restroom, get some water.
Better safe than sorry, so people can go to the bathroom.
Yeah, so let's take a 10-minute break, come back at 10:25, and I'm going to show you how to sort stuff.
I'm gonna go fold laundry for practice.
I guess reduce would be good for that factorial. Huh. Another way to do it, I guess.
Yeah, I actually did use the reduce method for the factorial question.
And you have to, every time you run code with reduce, you have to do the import functools at the top, or is there like a way to universally just import it every time?
I'm not certain, but I definitely did import func tools, and I also imported the operator that allowed me to actually use operators as well.
For like what? Can you describe that just so I'm tracking what you're talking about? Did it import
So
these operators?
for the factorial question, I just wanted to multiply the numbers inside the array itself. So I would actually have to import func tools and then import operators so I could use the multiplication operator. Otherwise, I wasn't allowed to for some reason. I don't know.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
So I guess to better
So for
explain
that,
it is,
so basically to do factorial with reduce, right? Like your ag would have to be 1, because you don't want to multiply it by 0 or else you get 0, right? So it would basically be functools.reduce lambda ag item, and then it would say ag times item. And then he hasn't shown us yet, but there's a way to set the starting value for your aggregator. So to do factorial, you'd have to set it as 1, so that they can multiply. Well, actually, it would default to the first value, so you could still do it.
what I meant when I said I imported the operators, instead of writing out lambda and the entire length, I just wrote reduce parentheses operator dot mul, which meant to use the multiplication operator, and I just typed in my list. So I just skipped over the lambda and the perimeters inside and just did the operator multiplication of my list. So all it does is basically just skims down what you have to type out.
Yeah, I just made it work right now by I made a list for the range for the factorial, and I just had it start at 1 and then end at whatever number I put in plus 1. So it's still the same number of items, but it was just like, because the last one's non-inclusive whenever you do the range command or whatever the hell. And it worked. I mean, it's working right now. It's just kind of weird.
Sweet.
I feel like, does anyone else feel like
I just updated mine to, I mean, it should be running in Python 3 now, but I didn't have to do any of that to make it the factorial. I literally just changed it to an asterisk instead of a plus, and it worked for mine.
Oh, inside of that?
Yeah, we were talking about using the reduce function for it.
No, that's what I'm talking about, is in the reduce function. If you use it.
Oh yeah, that's what I was saying, is that since it defaults to the first value, you should be fine to do that.
Yeah, you didn't have to do change anything to make it work.
Okay.
That's actually what I did use in JavaScript, is the reduce function for the factorial.
I just feel generally behind with a lot of this. I'm still trying to grasp a lot of the little.
You're not behind. I'm right there with you.
Me too, guys. Me too.
I feel like most of the challenges is just wrapping your head around the logic. Once you understand the logic, the code just can come. You can Google everything you need to know how to do it. You just need to know what you're trying to do. That's the problem.
Well, I feel like I can do these challenges. It takes me a while, but I can figure it out eventually. But right now, as soon as it gets more complicated, I'm still going to be working on the basic stuff. And this is going to be rough. A lot of stuff I'm sure is going to be really rough soon.
Yeah, we got to do more getting together.
You'll be fine, because Skylar finishes it 10 minutes after the lecture is done. So as soon as he's done, you can just get him to help you out.
Yeah, for sure. And by the way, I've only had a couple people reach out. I'm definitely down to help. It helps me learn. I'm not saying I'm a pro by any means. I'm definitely not. I'm here with y'all. So I just love helping.
Skylar helped me the other day after class. And he explained the 4 in loops really well, actually.
Nice. But what confused me most is the weird, the exporting to the thing to make the files work, and all that weird stuff around it, the weird importing that you would never just assume. You're trying to do this function, it doesn't work, and then somehow you have to import this library or set or whatever, or like exporting it to.
Hello class, welcome back. So in the last half hour we got here before our guest panel comes in, I want to show you just a couple more things Python. So first I want to go over sorting real quick. So I think sorting is very important. This is something a lot of junior developers are kind of bad at, but I think that this is something I have to do just all the time as a web developer. And I don't know, I think it's a very important thing to learn, and it really distinguishes like a junior developer from an intermediate developer, is being able to sort anything in any way. So Python is a little bit interesting in that it actually provides many different ways to sort things. So, you know, for example, I could just have and then print sorted numbers, and then it sorts them for me numerically. Great. So that was super easy, but also not very flexible. You know, if I wanted them sorted a different way, I have to add extra parameters to sorted to tell it how I want to sort things. So there are a few different ways that you can sort things in Python. Some of those techniques are very simple, but not very flexible. And some of them are more complex and more flexible, more powerful. I'm going to show you the most complex, most powerful way to sort things in Python. A, because I think this is what you need to know, but also because this is roughly how sorting is going to work in other programming languages, particularly JavaScript. So for our sorting, there's one little utility function I had to import. Don't worry too much about this. There's just kind of weird historical reasons in Python why this is necessary, but this isn't an interesting part of our solution. So let's check out here. I've got a list of people. Got Alice, Bob, and Carol, all have different ages, different jobs. And now in order to actually sort the list, I'm going to call sorted, passing in the list that I want to sort. And then this key function is specifying how I want to sort it. What should be in front of what or behind what. And so this is where I have to use this CMP to key that kind of just converts my sorting function into a slightly different format so that sorted can actually use it. Again, this is just kind of a weird legacy thing from Python 2 that got updated kind of strangely. And now this is how you have to sort your code, how you have to write your sort code. But it's just this one extra step. We have to call CMP to key here. It's not a big deal. The interesting part is our actual sorting function. So in this case, I chose to use a regular function with def instead of a lambda, just because this function is going to be a little bit more complicated. I don't think I want to write it on one line. So I used a regular function. So what I want to point out first of all is that this function takes 2 input arguments. So unlike map and filter, where we're looking at elements 1 at a time, when we sort, we're looking at elements 2 at a time. Now, our job in this function is to return a number that indicates how the items should be sorted relative to each other. So I return 1, or actually return any positive number to indicate that A gets sorted before B, and any negative number to indicate that B gets sorted before A. And then also importantly, return 0 to indicate that you don't care which is first. So for example, if the 2 elements are the exact same number, like you don't care which 2 gets sorted first in the array in the list. So you would just return 0 in that case. So here, we want to, let's sort these people by age. Right now, they're not sorted by age. So if I want to do that, I'm going to do some comparisons. So if A minus B is greater than 1, we will return 1. Well, if A minus B is less than 1, we'll return -1. Well, if A equals B, we return 0. So now this is describing, just relatively how we can prioritize our people relative to each other, how we sort them. So for example, we compare Alice to Bob. 44 minus 49 is, wait, sorry, this should be comparing to 0. So yeah, if it's positive, we return 1. If it's negative, we return -1. If they're the same, we return 0. All right, so I almost forgot. A and B are not numbers in this case, they are dictionaries. So I have to actually get the age property out of these guys. So we're going to say,
Is there dot notation in Python?
dot notation is for objects, not for dictionaries.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thanks.
How did you do that shortcut where you wrote on all of them?
Hold down Option or Alt, and then click in multiple places, and you can get multiple cursors. It's like one of the only VS Code features that I actually use. For the most part, all the keyboard shortcuts I use are just Vim shortcuts. All right, so let's try this again.
That is such a fantastic tool.
What am I missing here? Oh, right. There's other code here that I was going to show you later, which is intended to throw an error. Okay, now we will print sorted people. Okay, great. So here we have sorted our people by their age. So originally the names were in alphabetical order, Alice, Bob, Carol, but I've sorted them by age. So Carol goes first at 35, then Alice at 44, and Bob at 49. So this is, basically what a sorting function looks like, a proper sorting function. In some simpler cases, you can get away with writing simpler functions, using the different other Python sorting techniques. But for like serious problems or for very awkward problems, you'll have to specify exactly where you want things to be relative to each other. There might not be like a super elegant, like one-line function that lets you describe the entire sort. Evan?
So in your sorted function, you have key equals and then your stuff. How would you search Google to see what all like the sorted function can support? So I know it can do like key equals linked or min max, but like how would I even search that in Google? Because when I come up, it just thinks I'm talking about like dictionary keys.
Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna be honest, it was actually very hard for me to discover this syntax in Python. Like, it's not the first thing you'll find if you look for sorting in Python. Like, people will rush to show you the easier methods and all the shortcuts that Python provides. But the thing is that I knew that this is what I wanted, that I needed to be able to write an arbitrary comparison function. They call this a comparison or comparator function in computer science lingo. So I just kept looking until I found this solution. Someone saying like, oh, it's not super popular, but you can import this tool that lets you convert this function into the other format, and then it's going to work the way you want. In Python 2, actually, this was even easier to do, but for some reason in Python 3, it has become kind of awkward. I don't know why. But yeah, so I just knew that this was what I wanted to do, and I looked until I found it. If you're just searching for sorting in Python.
Make the comp to key work?
I'm sorry, wait, what's up?
What did you import to make the comp to key work?
So it's again from functools.
Oh, but you added import comp to key. Okay.
Yeah, so I guess we did the import slightly differently, which gives you kind of a preview of your future importing problems you're going to have. And there's some reading on importing tonight, so you're going to dig into this a little more. But here, I imported the entire functools module, and then later on, I can access properties off of it. So after importing functools, I can access functools.reduce. In this file, I did things a little bit differently. I didn't import the entire functools. I just grabbed one specific function off of it, CMP to key, and imported just that. So just kind of a stylistic difference. Depending on your needs, you might prefer one over the other.
If you import a bunch of tools and don't use them, and then you call your file to run it, do those imports slow down the file? And course, like in correlation to how big they are, or does it not actually go get that information? It just kind of opens the door. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. I want to say that for Python, it's a negligible difference, that if it makes any difference at all, it's not something you need to worry about. But for JavaScript, that is actually more of a concern, because like the client has to download all of your JavaScript onto their computer. So in JavaScript, if you import a whole bunch of functions that never get used, that actually makes your JavaScript files larger, and it's slower for your user to download. But there are automated tools that can help you deal with that. So it's not really something you have to think too hard about.
You should try to only import what you need and not just entire
Generally
libraries,
speaking,
just
yeah.
use one function. Gotcha.
Here, let me show you something that's like extra bad. This is something you should definitely not do. So here I did from functools import CMP to key, whatever. You can also do from functools import star. So this will import everything from the functools module, but not under functools. It'll just import all of those individual names right into this namespace, right into the scope. So if functools has like methods or variables defined in it that are the same name as names that I'm using in my code, that could potentially be a problem. So since this is importing a whole bunch of names, like I am responsible for knowing every name that gets imported from functools to make sure that it doesn't collide with other names that I'm using. Like if there was people in functools, then I just overrode it when I created this variable here.
Does that behavior still hold true when you just import functools, or is it only when you do from functools import?
So when I do import functools, everything is accessible on this functools module. It's not in the global namespace. So that makes it safer.
Okay. Thanks.
Yep. Questions?
Yeah, I actually had a question. For the sort by age, and you kind of alluded to this, but when you're just doing like, for this example specifically, don't you, like if you're just doing something as simple as like, numerical based on this key, can't you do like, just include that top line, for example. You know, if A age minus B, like in JavaScript, you can just say return A minus B.
Mhm.
And it will basically know all of the rest of that. In Python, could you do, you know, lambda A age minus B age or something?
So in this specific case, because we're just doing a numerical sort, you could write your function like this. This line here is exactly equivalent to all these lines here, but just in this specific case. Because like, think this through. So imagine if A age is greater than B age, then this is going to be a positive number, which we return. If B age is greater than A of age, then this will be a negative number that we return. And if they're the same, then we return 0. So just because we're doing a numerical sort in this specific case, this one line of code does handle these 3 cases the same way. But more commonly, like in a more complex problem that you're more likely to get at work, you would have to handle these 3 cases individually.
Okay. And then my second part of that question was, is sort and things like functions like this, do you use them commonly enough that you can just create your own personal, like, these are functions that I use all the time, and basically make your own Python module and then just say, like, from useful functions, import sort by age, or you know, and then just use that so you don't have to keep retyping it all the time?
Yeah. So I'm imagining, like, if you're making a bunch of dashboards for like some kind of web application, like, you know, lots of people like having sortable tables where you can like click the column headers and it sorts by different criteria. And maybe you even have like secondary sort criteria. So it's mainly sorted by one column, but if 2 things are equal in 2 columns, then you use the value in another column to figure out what gets sorted before what. And so that kind of thing can get pretty complicated, but it's likely that there would be many tables on that website that you would sort using the same logic. So in that case, like, I could put these sorting functions into my own module, into a file. You know, I might just call it like sorting functions.py or whatever, and then put a whole bunch of functions in there, and then just import that as it's needed, and then just put the function name in here instead of defining it up here.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. What other questions we got?
So just real quick, I might be overthinking this. What is it exactly that's stopping this from, like, so let's say 35 was our last number. So it compares the first one with the second one, and then it puts 44 first and then 49 second. But then when you compare 49 with 35, it would put 35 in the middle instead of putting it at the beginning. Oh, that's what you have. So how is it exactly that it works then? Or is that just the way the function works? It just arranges it on its own and figures it out in order to compare all the variables?
Yeah, it figures it out. I like to imagine that it looks at every possible combination of 2 items to understand what goes in front of what, but the actual algorithm is more efficient than that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think under the hood, it's using like quick sort or merge sort or something like that. Some well understood sorting algorithm. Danielle?
Yeah, with the import asterisk you used to use, I actually had to use it yesterday for the linear search problem, because I had to do the linear search and the global linear search. And no matter how I did it to import the second function, I couldn't. So the only way I could do it was by importing asterisk.
There should be another way, but yeah, if you need to do that, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, I thought I was making a typo or something, but I checked 1,000 times and I just couldn't, it wouldn't load. So I had to do it like that.
Maybe we can check it out offline at some point.
All right, thanks.
All right, do we have any other questions about sorting?
I just don't understand what is key actually doing? Sorry, I'm trying to like grasp the concept of it. And why do you need comp to key? What is that? Or CMP to key?
So the key is the function that we use to describe how to sort the list. So the key functions are like a Python 3 feature that is a function that takes one argument. So this is like a kind of new Python 3 feature. In Python 2, instead of using key, you gave it something called CMP, which was a 2-argument function that describes how to sort the list. So figure if your function only takes one argument, you can't really describe everything about how to sort the list. You can say like, use this property of an object to sort the list. But in order to really have flexibility in your sorting algorithm, you need to look at 2 elements at a time. So what this function is doing is it basically like converts our Python 2 style sorting function into a format that the Python 3 sorted method will accept. It's just weird historical baggage about the update from Python 2 to Python 3. They like kind of wanted to remove this functionality or like hide it away. Like, I don't know.
So that is just to enable you to look at 2 arguments in the function that you're about to put in after that. That's what that does.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, any other questions about sorting? All right, no other sorting questions. So let me show you just real quick. I want to do an example with error handling, and then we're going to have to take a break from today's lecture to chat with our Q&A panel. It's coming in about 10 minutes. Sorry, but I do want to show you this real quick. This is important stuff. All right, so we're done with sorting. Last thing I want to show you is error handling in Python. This is going to be pretty brief because the core concept is simple, but this is really an important concept that I expect that you will practice a lot throughout this bootcamp and especially throughout your career, because errors always, well, not always, but errors will happen in your applications. When you're writing these algorithms, you try to write your code precisely, meticulously so that it doesn't throw errors. But when you're building web applications, sometimes errors are just unavoidable. Maybe you need to read a file that may or may not exist. You don't know until you try. That's going to throw an error. Sometimes like the internet just hiccups for 2 seconds and it drops something and like the data gets malformed in transit and throws an error. And there's just nothing you can do to stop that. It's just the network is unreliable sometimes. So, but the best thing you can do is be prepared for errors and try to handle them gracefully so that you can, give a sensible message to your user, like, oops, something went wrong, try refreshing the page or try again later, instead of just a white screen or 500 error. It helps your users be more confident in your application if it doesn't look totally broken. So the way we do that in Python is using try except. So if you want to do something that might throw an error, put it in a try block. So in this case, I want to try to add some values together. I got a number and a string, going to add them into the C, but Python doesn't like that. That's going to throw an error. So I put it into a try block. Now, if we throw an error in this try block, it's going to skip the rest of the try block and then instead execute the code in the except block. And then afterwards, it just continues on. How do you spell continuing? It looks wrong. So many vowels. Anyways.
Where's your hard?
Indeed. So we can see we never get the print for we did it because we throw an error on this line. And then it goes into the exception block and then prints this message instead. Now, usually it's not enough to just know that something went wrong. You need to know what went wrong. So we're going to alias this, set exception as E, print E. And so now here is our error message. Unsupported operand types for plus, int, and string. So A is an integer, B is a string, doesn't know how to add those together and throws an error, but it doesn't crash our entire program. We're still able to run more code. We get to see this continuing print out, but we get to know what went wrong and potentially handle that intelligently. Maybe we send a message to the user saying like, oops, we couldn't do it. Maybe we just try it again on our server. Okay, there's something I'm missing. Because when I print it out, it is automatically converting it into a usable format. So there's something I'm missing here to get it to actually compare to the string and say that it's correct. You might have to workshop this for a minute. Sorry about that. But so the point is, aliasing the exception is important. I have to have the as E in order to look at what the actual exception was. And then with a little bit of if else logic, I can, intelligently handle this exception instead of just crashing my entire program. Any questions about exception handling? I know that was extremely brief. And you're not going to really need this for your homework in the immediate future, but it is an important concept in programming in general. And when we get to application development, you might want to do a bit of this. And especially as a professional, this is really important. As a professional, half of the time on any feature I build is spent error handling.
So I just wanted to clarify, because I'm looking at the notes that you already have up for today compared to what you're typing here. Is the exception as E, is that line of code combined? Is E the actual error message then?
E is the error. It has other properties on it in addition to the message. So it's an object, which we'll talk about next week. it has various methods on it and other data. One of the properties it has on it is the message itself. And I need to figure out a more precise way to access it. But I don't think this is the time for it. We need to get our guest speakers in here in a second. And actually, I think they can't find our Zoom room. So I'm going to have to give that to them real quick. So let's take a couple more questions here, and then we're going to pause for 2 or 3 minutes.
I have a question.
What's up?
So when would we depend on just the exceptions that the program throws, as opposed to like actually creating our own exception and then just printing out the exception? Isn't that kind of redundant? Like, wouldn't we get the same error in, like, let's say the console or whatever?
I'm sorry.
If there's an exception.
How does this differ from the error we'd get if we just ran it without the try block?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, if you don't have the try catch, the error stops your program.
Okay.
So.
Oh, so this would allow the program to somehow continue, even if there was some problem with it.
Right. So here we get the error unsupported operands, and then we never get this print statement.
That makes sense.
Okay.
So yeah, unexpected errors should not take down your server entirely. So we use exception handling in order to keep things running.
That's nice. Does this work for what if you accidentally had an infinite loop in that try? Does it catch it after so many iterations, or?
I'm not sure. I wonder
I'll have to
if
give it a shot.
Python maybe throws an error when it runs out of memory or right before it runs out of memory, and that would take you into the except block. Or it might just get stuck here forever. I'm not really sure.
Noted.
Is there something like throw that would throw exception, which would just end up doing the same thing as opposed to print exception or print the error? Sorry.
In Python, we call
raise.
that raise. Is it this is a function? Oh, we gotta. What? There we go. So here I just manually create an exception. I raised it, and it does the same thing as an unhandled exception, and it takes me into the except block.
So yesterday I accidentally did an infinite while loop, and I was running into a problem where my terminal wasn't telling me anything. So I thought that it just, and I think this happened to, is it Maya? This happened to Maya as well, where the terminal wasn't giving any indication that that was what was going on. So I think we were both like, my code's not running. What's happening? Why is my VS code all of a sudden not running my file? And thankfully, Avery was able to help me figure out that I had an infinite, that's the reason why. But it didn't give, again, any sort of error. So is this a good example of when, like, as we're trying to figure out, you know, we didn't have an error coming up saying, hey, there's something wrong here. So like putting that try maybe in front of our while loop.
I just tried it and didn't work. It still locked it up the same way you just described.
I want to consider putting print statements in your while loops to see if you're frozen or just doing too much work infinitely. So this, I think, kind of clears it up that I'm just stuck in an infinite loop here.
Oh, okay. Yeah, looking back, I don't think I had a print statement. So that's a good idea. Okay.
What's the shortcut for canceling out of that again?
Control C.
Okay.
Yeah. So do we have any other questions about exception handling? This is a quick little demo we got here.
So we'd most likely use this whenever we're like implementing some new code to an existing body of work that we know works. But we just want to make sure that this little code isn't like suspicious or going to, like you said, like mess up the rest of it.
Yeah. And especially if you're doing something that you think might throw an error, like if you're accepting input from a user and they might give you invalid input that breaks the rest of your program, like you can't control what the user types in, but at least you can handle exceptions.
All right.
Cool. Well, thanks for all your questions, folks. So at this point, it's 11. I'm going to pause this lecture